Well, great. I think we can get started. This is a very prompt group. I just had to flick through to see all your faces. It's wonderful to see all these names and faces. Welcome to the Spring Member Meetup of the Norwegian-American Historical Association. I'm Amy Boxrud, and I want to give, first of all, a warm welcome to anyone who's a visitor or a first-time attendee to a NAHA event. We are very glad that you've decided to spend some of your weekend with us. And to those of you who are members, I want to say welcome and thank you for your membership. As you know, these are the kind of events that membership makes possible. All right, that's it for announcements. I'm going to turn things over to our new president, Scott Knutson. If you haven't met Scott, he lives in St. Paul and he joined the NAHA board in 2016. He served first as our treasurer during the last biennium, and now took over as our president in October. He's a partner at Taft Law in Minneapolis. And in addition to serving as president of NAHA, Scott also serves on the board of the local council of Boy Scouts, and he chairs the board of St. Paul's Landmark Center. So Scott, I will turn things over to you.
Well, thank you, Amy. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator today, Anna Peterson. Anna has been our editor since 2018. She currently is an associate professor of history at Luther College. She took her BA from Concordia in Scandinavian Studies, following up with a master's in history at the University of North Dakota, and finished with a PhD at Ohio State University. She recently published a book on the history of maternity leave in Norway, and she's currently researching the Norwegian-American run Bethany Indian Mission outside of Wittenberg, Wisconsin. Now, Anna will be the moderator today, and I'll turn it over to you, Anna. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. So it's my privilege to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kyle Ward. Dr. Ward currently serves as Director of Social Studies Education at Minnesota State University, Mankato, where he also teaches history. His knowledge of World War II is extensive. He wrote his PhD dissertation at Indiana State University on the way World War II was portrayed in US history textbooks, and published a book on that topic in 2008 titled The Pacific War and History Textbooks: How Historians, Educational Research, and Government Policies have influenced what students have read and learned about this event. He's done additional research on the changing interpretations and tellings of history, and has also published numerous books on that topic. Today, he'll be speaking about his current research project on the 99th Battalion, a unit of Norwegian-Americans and Norwegians in exile during World War II. Dr. Ward is actively involved in the 99th Battalion's Educational Foundation and currently serves on its board of directors. He, along with Odd Level, wrote an overview of this research project in last year's issue of Norwegian-American Studies. If you don't have a copy, I would encourage you to get one. And I'm looking forward to hearing how his research has developed since that last update. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Ward, and then following his presentation, I will be the moderator for the questions that you entered in the chat function. So like Amy said, you can type those at any time during his talk or after his talk, and I'll make sure that we get them to Dr. Ward. All right, take it away.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen here with everybody. And then as I do with my students all the time, Anna, can you give me a thumbs up? You can see my PowerPoint. Fantastic. Great, great, great. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out this afternoon and joining us on the Zoom meeting here. I really appreciate all this. I'm going to spend a few minutes here kind of talking about the history of the 99th Infantry Battalion. I do want to give a quick shout out and say thank you to Amy and Anna and Scott and Harrison for doing all this background work and getting all this set up as well. They've already done the introduction, so I don't have to go into any more detail here, but I do work at Minnesota State University, Mankato. I have my work email, and then the email I set up to do research about the 99th is on there as well. My request is, if we don't have time today and you have other questions that you want to ask, feel free to get a hold of me through either of these sources. More than happy to talk to you about this. Also, a major plea here is if you have a connection to the 99th, please feel free to get a hold of me and let me know that as well. I had a situation one time where I gave a presentation, and afterward they had a wonderful conversation with a lady who had all these connections and all these stories and stuff like that, but then we lost them, but never got a hold of us again. So if you want me to, I can bring this back later, or Amy and Anna will also have this information too, so they can share all that as well. And as long as I got this up here, let me give you my quick background to all this. I grew up in a Norwegian-American community in north central Minnesota. My father's side is not Norwegian, my mother's side is. My great-grandfather came from the Trondheim region. So I have kind of a background and interest in Norwegian history anyhow. I grew up fairly close to Camp Ripley. So even as a smaller boy, I had the chance to go over to their museum, which ties into something I was going to mention in a second here as well. And then over the years, teaching at different universities, I've been teaching World War II courses at Minnesota State Mankato. I did at a couple of the colleges before there as well. The reason I mentioned Camp Ripley is somewhere along the line when I had been there, they have an exhibit up about the 99th Infantry Battalion. And somewhere somebody had told me that, yeah, they trained here, but that's pretty much all they did. And that was kind of the end of the story. That's all I'd ever heard of. Jump ahead a number of years, I was working at St. Cloud State University, and I brought a group of my students there. We were doing a project with the Military Museum. And I was walking my students through the museum and giving them kind of history of the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, and we got to World War II, and we got to this exhibit, and I said, well, you know, this is just a small unit that just kind of trained here, kind of referred to like a home guard type of thing. And a young lady looked at me and she goes, that's not true at all. And it turned out her grandfather, Darcy Manthai is the young lady's name, her grandfather had served in the 99th. And she started telling me all these stories about them and how you had to be Norwegian, American, and everything else like that. I thought, okay, I don't know much about this. Well, as a side note to all this, I've done some work with the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And through the U.S. Holocaust Museum, one of the areas of expertise that I tried to give talks on is Norway and the Holocaust, or Scandinavia during the Holocaust, and the impact that it had on the Jewish population there and since as well. And at one of these workshops that we gave, we invited the 99th to come and do a presentation as well. And I sat there and listened to them and thought, okay, I know nothing about this. I grew up Norwegian-American. I grew up close to where the Camp Ripley was. I'm interested in World War II, and this missed me. So I keep thinking how many other people along the way. Also, I got to give a quick shout out to my partner in crime with all this. I met Old Lovell by doing one of these workshops, and we've been really good friends. I like what was said earlier too, as being a mentor. Not only is he a really good friend, but he's also been a mentor to me in this project. And we keep moving forward, trying to get this taken care of. A little thing called COVID has gotten in the way at this point in time that we're going to try to rectify along the way. So the question is, where do you start? And for me, I go back to what I consider the beginning, which is the German invasion of Norway. It was April 9th, 1940. Norway was invaded by the Germans. Norway and Denmark were both invaded by the Germans. They're going to become occupied. I wish we had time here today. If you don't know the story, do some more research because it's a fascinating story, and a more recent movie out too about how the King of Norway is able to escape and how the Norwegians were able to get their gold out of Norway as well. Two really fascinating stories. But for our story with the 99th, the two most important things is one, that a number of Norwegians were trapped abroad. Again, Old Lovell's biography talks about this as well. This is what happened to his dad. Norway had the third largest merchant marine trading fleet in the world, and probably the most modern in the 1930s as well. And I know there's somebody out there too I wish we could tap into, because he has a lot of expertise in this area here. But we ran into the situation where after Norway was captured, we got thousands of young Norwegian men trying to figure out what to do. If they go back to Norway, they're going to be captured too. So a lot of them are going to stay abroad. They want to get into this fight, and they got to try to figure out how to do that. The second one is the Norwegian-Americans themselves. This became kind of a rallying cry for a number of them. This is, for the most part, we could talk about this quite a bit too, but this is like the second or third generation from the first immigrant generations that are coming over here too. So there's a little bit more of a pride that's being developed along the way of being Norwegian. And they too are trying to figure out a way to get involved with this as well. There was one book written on the 99th back in the early 80s by Gerd Nyquist. And Gerd Nyquist, she had a really nice comment towards the end of her book about this. Basically, she interviewed all these guys and put their oral histories in paperback format here. But she referred this as the last of the immigrant generation. So this is the last of the Norwegian immigrant generation that's going to be joining the 99th later on. All right. Where did this whole idea come from? Why 1,000 Norwegians going to join this one battalion? It started with a gentleman by the name of General Raymond Lee. And you can see his picture in the bottom left. He was a military attaché in England as the war started. And what he had noticed is that all of these foreign people who were trapped out of their homeland, like Norwegians, like Danes, like the Poles, other people had set up their own governments in England at this point in time, were now training troops in Scotland as well. And the upper picture is Company Lingi, named after the original commander of the group here. This was the free Norwegians who were training to go over and fight. And so what happened is Raymond Lee watches this and he thinks to himself as he's coming back to Washington, D.C., well, we have the same population here, but that's just because of immigration. And maybe we can recruit some of these other people that are out there, plus these immigration populations that we have as well. Here's what we end up with. The original groups, the original ethnic units that they were going to create were Greek, Filipino, Austrian, Japanese, and Norwegian. Let me run through the numbers here. There was the first Filipino, and keep in mind the first Filipino, they were a territory of the United States. So technically they fell under being citizens, but there's also segregation in the military. So in San Luis Obispo, California, they're going to organize the first Filipino regiment battalion that's going to be fighting there. Here we then get the numbers. Here's the 99th. Here's the Norwegian. The 100 Japanese, if you know the history of World War II, this is a unique situation for them to be in because they've also been interned on the mainland. The 100th Japanese is going to be coming from the islands of Hawaii, which did not have an internment. Later on in the war, the 100th Japanese and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team Japanese are going to be put together, and they're going to end up being the most decorated unit in the entire war. So the family connection, if you will, with all these different battalions, you can see are going to pop up a few more times here. Last two are the Austrian and the Greek. Both those, they never really got off the ground. They got started, the Austrians actually were training in Indiana for a brief period of time before they just disbanded the whole thing. They didn't really get the numbers that they were looking for. If you're looking for some Trivial Pursuit, if you watch The Sound of Music, two of the Von Trapp boys will train with the 101st Austrian. The numbers, if you're wondering why the numbers got off there all of a sudden, they were supposed to be the 102nd Greek Battalion, but the Greece, I believe the story I was told, was celebrating its 122nd birthday anniversary of its formation at that time. And so they said, we wanted that number. So they got that number instead of being the 102nd. But this is what Raymond Lee is going to set up. He's going to start recruiting soldiers to fill into each of these different organizations. Well, we got to find a home. And there's nothing written about this, but my assumption is they figured out quickly that they want to do the epicenter of geographic epicenter of Norwegian immigration to the United States, might as well go to Minnesota. And the 99th was activated, this is basically on paper, on July 10th, 1942. And for military terms, on August 15th, 1942, this is the first morning report. So they're officially at the camp. And there's a few men there, but there's just not hundreds. We're not talking about full battalion at this point in time. They're slowly coming in and joining as they get here. The picture on the bottom right, that's Captain Hanson, I believe. At this time, he's going to become Major and then later Colonel Hanson. He's going to be in charge. Harold Hanson's going to be in charge of this entire unit. Throughout most of the war, he gets bumped down, switched over just because of military bureaucracy a couple of times. Real quickly, the thing that I find really interesting about him, having done a lot of military history, is he was beloved, absolutely positively beloved by his men. I have yet to find any kind of story or report that said anything negative about him as a leader. And the picture on the top that you're looking at, if you go to Camp Ripley today, that's the memorial that they've got set up, remembering the 99th, the fact that they got their start there. So, okay, we got the unit, we got the plan. Here's what you had to do. You had to be fluent in Norwegian. We had to find people who were able to speak Norwegian. Later on, I'll try to come back and talk about this, but it was kind of funny because we're going to be bringing in some of the merchant marines who are people from all over Norway, plus second, third, maybe fourth generation Norwegian-Americans. The language skills were kind of not only the dialects of Norway, but because they had been separated for so long, there was some kind of miscommunication. They were just kind of misunderstanding a little bit each other along the way. But I got to share my favorite quote here. This comes from Private Marvin Skogren. And this is in the front of Gerd Nyquist's book about the 99th when they were recruiting everybody here. And what they did is they sent out notice to all the camps and all the draft boards and said, if you can find somebody who can speak Norwegian, send them our way. So bulletin board information said, do you speak a foreign language? Skogren and others had said, no, I don't know how to speak a foreign language. I only know English and Norwegian. Well, it says a lot about the communities that they were living in, and up into the 1930s, 40s, how some people were still going to church that was all in Norwegian. They were speaking Norwegian at home. Maybe some schooling was going on in Norwegian as well here. But it was interesting how many of these men, different things I read about them. And the first reaction was, I don't speak a foreign language. I can only speak Norwegian or English here. I promise this won't turn into a big old military talk, but just to kind of explain something real quickly here. The chart I've got here shows during World War II kind of a basic outline of how the military would have been normally set up. And you have to, everything's kind of in the triangle shape. It's all heading up to a division and a corps and everything else like that. But it takes some of the smaller units, and battalion is one of the smaller units. It's going to be approximately 1,000 men, what you're going to have. What would happen is in a situation like this, we have to separate one of these units all by themselves. The 99th isn't going to report to a higher command. They are in and of themselves separate from everybody else, which is going to have an upside, but it's also going to have a downside because they don't have the support companies like everybody else does. So they needed to find their own medical corps. They needed to find their own headquarters. They needed to find all these different things, all the artillery and supplies and stuff like that that forced them into this area here. Trivial pursuit time. I got a few trivial pursuit things I'm going to share with you. The 99th will be the only battalion in the U.S. Army during World War II that will have 1,001 men. They had filled out, they had their 1,000, but then they found a dentist who could speak Norwegian. So they added a dentist, which leads to the second trivial pursuit point. This is the only battalion in the U.S. Army during World War II that has its own dentist. So they have 1,001 men, which makes them unique with their own dentist. So it makes them very, very rare. You find those usually higher up along the lines here. Truth be told, Camp Ripley wasn't very long. There wasn't that many men there. They did some training and stuff like that, but they had to move. Fort Snelling is going to be where they're heading to next in Minnesota. Fort Snelling is going to be a perfect place for them to start getting organized. Not only are we still in the Midwest, but it's a huge transit area. I've been amazed at how many soldiers during World War II had to go through Fort Snelling. No matter where they were going to, what branch of the military and stuff like that, you just saw a ton of these young men had to spend time at Fort Snelling. So if you're trying to bring troops in from all over the US, this is where they're going to be coming from. We got the estimate now, Eric Brun, who is the president of the 99th Association, has been looking into this, and his best guess is that probably about 40 to 45% of the 99th is going to be coming from the upper Midwest, predominantly Minnesota, but North, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Iowa is where we're going to see a lot. We'll get a lot from Wisconsin, or a lot from Washington, Oregon, out west, stuff like that. But the last category is, this sounds odd right away from me, the first time I heard it, but was Brooklyn. Brooklyn, New York had a very large Norwegian population, and a lot of those merchant mariners got off their ships there, and so that's where they're going to be recruited from. The US government sent out notifications to all these different bases saying, if you can speak Norwegian, this is where you need to go. A great story is from one of the veterans who he heard about this. He was from Minnesota originally, did have Scandinavian, had Norwegian background. And he said, yeah, I signed up the second I saw that. I didn't know what they were doing. I just wanted to get going. And somebody asked him in one of these oral histories, like, so was it, being Norwegian, Norwegian-American, going back to Minnesota, what was it? He finally said, no, snakes. In the South, there are way too many snakes. I just wanted to get out of the South as fast as I could. So they recruited him one way or the other. Fort Snelling, those of you who are from Minnesota, I thought this is interesting. I wanted to throw this out here too. It was interesting how many people talked about driving out to Fort Snelling, how they had to get in the car and go out to Fort Snelling because it was separate from the Twin Cities. Those of you in Twin Cities now look at it, and I view Fort Snelling as being part of the Twin Cities, but back then it was something separate that they had to get to. Two problems in Fort Snelling. One is the geography. It's not a perfect basic training campground, especially if you want to start training for skiing. We're going to have to improve on that. And two, this picture kind of depicts the second problem. They were too close to family and friends. There were way too many parties. There were way too many picnics. They were interviewed by radio stations and newspapers. They went to the Gopher game and gave a drill exhibition at halftime into parades. The commanders were getting tired of trying to keep these guys on base all the time here because there's always some sort of request for them to do something. Well, it worked out perfectly. They're off to Colorado. You're going to learn how to ski. I'm going to guess Colorado will win this conversation against Minnesota time and time again here. They're going to head to Camp Hale, which is in a training camp that they built specifically, basically for the 10th Mountain Infantry, 10th Mountain Division, ski division that's going to be out there. When they get there, you can see, I got another picture I'll show after this one too, but you can see they built an entire city. This is all this, everything you see there was built just before or during World War II for the sole purpose of training the ski troops that were coming in here. As you can see on the left, I'm not going to go through every single thing there, but this place was amazing. One soldier is going to complain later on and say, yeah, the Camp Hale was just an incredible, running water and toilets and heating and everything else like that. It's too bad we didn't get a chance to stay there because they were up in the mountains training most of the time. So they got to go by it a lot and see it, check it out once in a while here. Notice the altitude. One veteran, I shouldn't say one, a number of veterans like to tell the story. One day they were training up high in the mountains. They'd been up there for a while. And all of a sudden across the radio, they hear this guy screaming at them going, "What are you guys doing? Get off this airwave." And they're like, "What do you mean get off this airwave?" And he's telling them, this is a military channel. You guys shouldn't be on this. Well, what they found out was a pilot who was flying at the time. And they go, no, we're ski troops. We're training here. And they got into a conversation. They finally found out the ski troops were at a higher altitude than the plane was at that point in time. So the training is going to be rigorous. It's going to be up there in the mountains. Two pictures from Camp Hale that you can see, the backpack, the rucksack that they've got there, on average, about 90 pounds. When the average soldier also weighed about 130 to 140. That's a lot of weight that they had to carry up into the mountains at that altitude, which is amazing every time I think about it. The training is going to be extremely rigorous. I have no proof of this, but from everything I've read so far, this is going to be a lot tougher than what the average soldier is going to be going through. They're going to be there a lot longer. The training is going to be very rigorous every step of the way. And skiing is going to become a major part of it. Here they are with their winter garb on, winter camouflage, learning some tactical ski training as well. It is interesting to note the 10th Mountain Division and the 99th did not work together. They were at the same camp, but they did not have a connection. So they're being trained for kind of two different missions is the way it's going to look like here with everything. Let me add a quick side note to all this. During World War II, a joint effort between the US and the Canadian forces, where they came up with the idea of creating the first special service force. And what this is going to end up being is a joint group between Canadians and Americans. And today we'd call it special forces. That wasn't the term that they were using at the time here, but when they came up with the idea, the US military said, okay, we can't just grab green troops. We can't just grab some 18-year-old, send them up here and start doing this training. We need somebody who's got more skills along the way. 90 members of the 99th will be recruited and sent up. So the 99th will help give birth to the first special service force. Two things to note here. One, that's the patch that they would have worn on their left arm, the US and Canada patch. That's going to come back into play again later on. My very first screen, you saw the patch that the 99th had with the Norwegian flag on it, the red, white, and blue, representing both the United States and Norway. And now this is the men who left the 99th and now with the 1st Special Service Force are going to have the arrowhead on there. The 1st Special Service Force is made famous by, I think it was 1950s or 1960s movie, The Devil's Brigade. Having talked to one expert on this, they said they got the name right, everything else is historically wrong, but the name was right here. They helped produce and promoting along the way that way. Okay, so here's the big thing that I've been talking to my colleague Eric Brun about. Old Level and I have had some conversations about this too. So here's the theory, is that they were trained to go into Norway. Well, my research and what we've been uncovering so far is that we're coming up with something that we think is a new theory. And we're trying to do more research on this. During World War II, there was something called Operation Fortitude North. And Operation Fortitude North was a decoy, a way to convince the Germans that we were not going to attack in Normandy or on the D-Day beaches or in France, that we were going to go someplace else. And we had to convince Germany that we were going to do something like this. Key to my belief that all this is, because of the invasion of Norway, Germany had about 350 to 400,000 troops in Norway. They also have subs, they have tanks, they have artillery, they have planes. They've got an entire army, really a vast army, trying to protect the entire coast of Norway here. So if you are a military strategist, you're trying to figure out a way to hit Germany and open up a second front so that Russia can get some relief and you can end this war at this point in time, you do not want 350,000 extra Germans coming to wherever you are. So you need to figure out a way to keep them where they are at this time. So you're going to try to develop some sort of idea of trying to convince them to do this. Two things I've found in the research here recently. First, there was the second Washington Conference, which happened for about a week at the end of June in 1942. In that conference, you can see all the official paperwork that goes back and forth between the British High Command. Churchill's in Washington, D.C., and he's brought his High Command. They bring in Marshall, FDR's in Washington, and our High Command too, so we bring the joint forces together. And they start having these conversations. Well, some of the documents that we found, they are spending a lot of time talking about, should the second front be in Norway? Stalin has asked that it should be in Norway. Hitler has made comments a few times that World War II is going to be won and lost in Norway. So they start focusing in on this. And you see all these conversations going back and forth. One of the plans that comes up is maybe we should land a small force in the northern part of Norway, helping keeping the sea lanes open so we can get supplies to Russia. You can see as you read through the minutes of that meeting, they're kind of, okay, we land in, let's just say, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, 1,000 Norwegian-speaking skiers into northern Norway. Can we guarantee that they'll have supplies? Can we guarantee that, you know, what happens, we don't want them overrun and just destroyed or something like that along the way here. What's interesting is Chief of Staff Marshall had a conversation with Churchill, and he left a note and he said, talk to Churchill, called Roosevelt on the phone and talked to him about this situation. And the way it reads out, you can see, yeah, dropping 1,000 men up in northern Norway is not going to make a ton of sense here, but we can do something else with them. And that's where the paper trail dies out at this point in time. No one came forward and said, here's what I think we're going to do here. We know later on that Eisenhower and Churchill will have a conversation about the 99th and what they should be doing with them as well. By the way, this isn't the only time Eisenhower is going to pop up with the 99th. You're going to see the overall commander in the 99th have a few connections that are really interesting along the way here. So here's what we do know. The 99th is a separate battalion. A battalion in military terms is a very small group of men. This is not a division with 15,000, it's not a corps or anything else like that. But they're really highly publicized. I went in when I had a chance to go into these online newspaper sites, And I was just absolutely floored at how many times the newspapers across the country talked about them. There are dozens of stories about them. Newspapers covered them, radios covered them, celebrities would actually show up to Camp Hale, news media was going to be there. This, by the way, is where the title for this talk came from. In one newspaper, and this was copied across the country, so you could find this in numerous papers all the way across the country. They were talking about these foreign legions, as they were talking to mention them at the time. And the quote that came from this one, let me read this to you real quickly. They said, "Newest is the Greek, oldest is the Japanese, biggest is the Filipino, but toughest is the Norwegian." So the Norwegians were the toughest unit that they could find. This is just a massively impressive group that they were working with here. Last point I want to make with this here. The two pictures you're looking at, if you can't see it quite clearly, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I believe, I have to check this again, but I think that's Major Hanson, who's standing by his door there talking to him. And that is the 99th in the background, meeting him. The men of the 99th, when you read their stories later on, those that talked about this, like, yeah, we went to do some training and all of a sudden this car showed up and there was the president and they were taking pictures and they were filming it and all this other stuff like that too. So those of us who are working on this is our theory, is that using the 99th to actually land in Norway didn't really make a whole lot of sense, especially since that wasn't the target area. We were going to go into Normandy. But how do we keep the Germans in Normandy or in Norway so they don't actually send troops down to Normandy? You highly publicize the heck out of 1001 Norwegian-Americans who just happen to be able to speak Norwegian, who just happen to be prepared to have their skis ready to go. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Where do you think they're going to go, Germans? Take a guess here with us. So my belief is that they were a fantastic decoy. And the victory at Normandy is going to be in part because the 99th is going to be able to hold the Germans in place up in Norway throughout this entire time here. Well, we got to get over to the war. By August 1943, they head to New York and then they're off to Scotland to help confirm my theory that they're part of Operation Fortitude North. There was word that they went to Scotland. Scotland's important because that's where Camp Lingy was. That wasn't a normal place for the GIs to be landing. I mean, Scotland's going to be farther to the north in England. If you're going to make an invasion into Normandy, into France, why go to Scotland? They're going to put them in Scotland, I think, one more time, one last decoy, but then they disappear. You don't hear the 99th again in any newspaper, any radio broadcast or anything until the summer of 1945. So they completely have gone off the radar for a while here, leaving the Germans to wonder, if you've got spies in the US who are watching all this, where in the heck are these guys? Where'd they go? Oh, they're in Scotland. Okay, we've got this here. In England, this should have been a tip. If there would have been a spy at the docks, I think they would have been able to piece this together real quickly. The 99th did not bring their skis with them. They did not bring their winter gear with them. That was all left behind. They were told, hey, when you get to England, we got all this stuff for you. Don't worry, we'll get this taken care of. But they now are starting to train just as an infantry unit. They are just foot soldiers at this point. They kind of lose the specialized category of being on the skis, training that way here. One quick interesting side note here. During World War II, the US government tried to figure out the best meal plan that you could think of. Those of you who've been in the military since, MREs, K rations, C rations, and stuff like that, they brought these to the 99th and they tested it on them. They ran these guys like dogs during the day. I can't imagine the work they did. Then they fed them and they were taking all this information down, writing down. They said, okay, they need this much protein, they need these vitamins, chocolate, all this stuff here. So anytime you watch a war film and see these guys open up their food packets, that's thank you to the 99th, who kind of the guinea pigs to see what exactly did somebody need to work this hard, what kind of energy did they need to rebuild quickly on the run here. So they had the ration testing that was set up. Quick side note, again, is the 99th got a good reputation going for itself. And they were the ones who were put in charge of guarding the plans for the invasion of Normandy. So the physical place that they were actually holding the plans for the invasion of Normandy, there were 99th men who were put in charge of that, which their guard duty kind of follows them along the way here. All right, if you look at the date here, June 6, 1944 is the infamous D-Day landings. You can see that on June 21st, 1944, the 99th will land at Omaha Beach. So they're there about 2 weeks afterwards here. For those of you who are into the what if type of stories, the 99th would have landed probably a week or so earlier and been part of the fighting that took place in the Normandy region a little bit more, but a huge storm came up in the English Channel, and they had to dock the ships, I want to say, for the better part of a week before they could get back out there. So again, if you think about it, if Eisenhower would have waited any longer to do this invasion, he probably would have been hit with this exact same storm. The map you're looking at, you'll notice up on the peninsula to the upper left, the city of Cherbourg. And that's where the 99th is headed to. This doesn't get a lot of attention in military books and movies and stuff like that, but the Americans had to swing up that way. They didn't want the Germans to their rear as they were moving forward here. Cherbourg is also a major port area, and they were hoping to open that up as well so they could bring in. The 99th is going to be, they'll be shelled sometimes, there'll be some gunfights and stuff like that, but they're really not quite in the war as of yet. Cherbourg stood out for two reasons, two things that really kind of jumped out when I was reading some of these manuscripts or stories that the soldiers left behind. One is when they got inside a fort, keep in mind that about 40% of these guys are coming from Norway itself. When they got inside the fort, they found the German supplies, and in that fort were a number of supplies that came from Norway. A lot of canned foods, equipment, stuff that was made in Norway that was sent down. And you get this sense that that was a trigger moment for a lot of those soldiers because they knew what their families were going through at home. And the war takes on kind of a different meaning. You can see, especially for some of the soldiers, there's a new level of anger that's going to come through with this as well. A side story, one of my favorites for the 99th that I've got to share here. One of the replacements told this story in something he had written up. Major Hanson, I believe it was a warehouse. There was a strategic warehouse. He takes two of his soldiers, puts them in front of the front door and says, you guys are in charge here. You're on guard duty. Nobody, and I mean nobody, gets into this storage area here whatsoever until I come back and give permission, okay? Yep, not a problem. Major Hanson takes off. These two young men are standing here, it sounds like, for about an hour or two. And the story goes that a small caravan of Jeeps pull up outside, and they get there and they kind of get out of the Jeep and they're starting to mill around. They're having a conversation, and these two soldiers are just standing there. And finally, somebody just walks up and says, you know, quick salute and let us in here, gentlemen. And they said, no, their orders said absolutely positively not. You know, who gave you this order? Well, our commander. Who's your commander? And they said, well, we'll have to talk to him later on. They said, okay, salute, and they take off. Major Hanson came back, had a conversation later, and informed them, when General Dwight Eisenhower wants to get into a storage room, you can let him in. He has clearance. He's fine enough along the way. So they kept the five-star commander-in-chief away from that at that point in time. To his credit, I'm going to give Eisenhower just a ton of credit. He wasn't mad. No one got in trouble. He kind of thought it was pretty funny that these guys said, no, you don't have the clearance. Major Hanson didn't say you could get in there. Okay, you can see the city's name in the background, Elbeuf in France. For the 99th, when they leave the peninsula and they start heading closer to Paris, this is their first fight. This is the first time the entire battalion's under attack by the Germans. To their credit, they do a fantastic job. They did they were really well trained. It was quite clear. Morning reports are going to be clear about that as well. Unfortunately, they're going to lose some soldiers. And this changes some of their attitudes as well once you start seeing colleagues and friends who are wounded and killed along the way here. What's interesting here is that you get the non-Norwegians start joining, because you have these replacements that come in and the military doesn't care anymore. We're not going to Norway with you guys, so we're just going to put anybody in along the way here. You start seeing more planks and tailors. I think some of the other more non-Norwegian sounding names are going to come in. The best story about this is one, Pete, and I wrote this down to see if I could actually say it, Di Pietropalo. So Pete Di Pietropalo, an Italian-American, showed up. into this group. The first sergeant did roll call. Day 1, couldn't get the last name. Roll call. Day 2, couldn't get the last name. Pete DiPietro finally looked up and said, hey, just call me Pete Olson. And that's who he became. He became Pete Olson for the rest of the war. He thought it much easier for the Norwegians to handle Olson than trying to handle his own name here. But you start seeing there's a Gutierrez who's going to join the unit here as well. We move across France. We're following the major forces here. The battalion is loved by commanders because I always think of it as this way. It's like when you find that money between the couch cushions or in the laundry machine, stuff like that, all of a sudden you've got this extra money. This is how they treated the 99th. It's like, oh, we've got them. We can use them. Let's put them here. Let's put them there. 2 quick things. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but the 99th needs to get credit. The first German city to fall, Aachen, the 99th was there. They actually helped close off that city and keep the Germans from escaping or sending in supplies. So they were right at the roadblock along the way there. But probably most importantly and most well recognized is going to be the Battle of the Bulge that's going to take place in December and January of 1944, 1945. The city of Mamadi, which is in the northern part of our map here. And in military terms, they call this the Northern Shoulder. And I'm going to give a quick shout out to the Northern Shoulder because what turns out is we focus in on Bastogne because of, like, if you've seen the Band of Brothers movies and stuff like that, and the surrounded and the stories, it's a fantastic story and the bravery is unbelievable. But in terms of needs for roads and transportation and getting to what the Germans wanted, there were more supply depots, and the city of Antwerp was closer to the northern end. So if you read the history of the Battle of the Bulge, you're going to see more SS troops. You're going to see more highly trained troops, more equipment sent by the Germans through the north. So on December 17th, they're going to be sent to the city of Malmedy to help stop that attack that's coming in up against the north. On December 21st, they are going to be hit hard. The B Company of the 99th is going to be attacked by the 1st SS Division. If you know about World War II, the SS is kind of their elite forces. The one thing that there are a few times that when you read diaries and journals and memoirs of 1,000 men, that more times than not, this story happened, that story happened, everything else like that. This is one of those stories that anybody that was there said the same thing. The Germans came across this open field and just were screaming this battle cry of surrender or die. And it really shook the men of the 99th. That was something that 70 years later, they were still talking about, kind of how eerie it was. To their full and complete credit, the 99th held. And they were able to stop the SS from getting any further. They didn't get to the supply areas. They didn't get any more gasoline, and they were able to turn them around. 2 tidbits. One, if you've ever heard of the Mamadi Massacre, this is when the SS commander didn't want to hold the American troops as prisoners of war. So he had them all killed in an open field. Some of the survivors are going to make it into the 99th. So the 99th is going to be able to protect a handful of survivors, which becomes very important later on when the Nuremberg trials happen, because those survivors are going to be able to go back and point and say, these are the men that did this to us. The other, this is funny, but also terrifying at the time. It became a running joke with these veterans later on, but at the time, I know they have to be positively terrified. Operation Greif, named after a German commander. If you've ever seen the movie The Battle of the Bulge or anything about the Battle of the Bulge, this is where German troops dressed up as Americans stole American equipment and were driving around and saying, no, you can't take this way, you got to go that way. Oh, they cut down signs and do all this stuff. Well, it didn't take long, but the Americans figured out fairly quickly that was going on. The big impact was it put doubt in everybody's mind. Hey, I don't know you. Why are you here? Why is this? You're with the 106th Division? Isn't that a little farther north for you? What are you doing? Stuff like that. Think about this. And the men talked about this constantly. Here you've got 1,001 men from a battalion who all have accents. They have Norwegian accents. So people would hear them talking, and sometimes they'd break into Norwegian, they'd forget as they're talking. And these other people from these other divisions were very, very, very leery. The men of the 99th had guns pulled on them a few times, of people going, "Ah, you got a thick accent. You don't sound like you come from the United States here," or anything else. This is the picture. This is where the SS attacked them across that open field that was there, and they were able to hold them off. They stayed in the Battle of the Bulge because the Battle of the Bulge lasts for a number of weeks. It wasn't just a one-day battle here. They fought on the front lines here for 16 days, and then they were removed, and they went to France, actually back to the coast in France for rest and relaxation. But the military came up with a new idea. Let's make them a part of a new regiment. If you go back to that chart I had before, we need 3 battalions to make up our regiment at this point in time. So we're going to take the 99th. We're going to take some Rangers. So if you know your military history, the Rangers are a specialized force here. And the 1st Special Service Force is back again. So those 90 men who joined the 1st Special Service Force are coming back. You can tell all this by looking at their arm patch. The arm patch is a combination of everything. One, it's the arrowhead from the 1st Special Service Force. It's the Norwegian ship from the 99th. And the black scroll is what the Rangers used to wear. So this is a very unique regimental patch that they're going to have here. They'll do some of their new unit training, and then they're back in, and they're headed back into Germany. This time under General Patton. Doing the research or history of the 99th is tiresome because they moved around so much. You have to find which major unit they belong to at different times here. But they'll follow Patton into Germany at this point in time. And then 2 major things are going to take place. One, and you can see the picture. There's Eisenhower again. This is Merker's Mine. And literally just this morning, if you're watching TV, I noticed one of the channels showed Monuments Men. If you watch the movie Monuments Men, that's what happened at Merker's Mine. This is where all the artwork, all the gold, everything the Nazis had stole from Europe, a vast majority of it's going to be at Merker's Mine. And so the Monument Men were able to uncover that and find it. The 99th got to be the Guards. They were the ones that transported this from Merker's Mine to where it needed to be. So a very important job. If you watch Monuments Men, by the way, pay really close attention because they get less than 3 seconds worth of airtime. But you can see the 99th packing up, I think it is. They show them shutting a door, and down the road, they end up going at this point in time. The quick side story I want to share here is having a conversation with one of the wives of one of the 99ers. We were talking that my joke was, so, how much gold, accidentally got made back home? And they're like, no. US government came in and literally every single piece of gold, silver, jewelry, treasure, artwork, all was written down. The nothing got away from them. They checked everything quadruple times here. Except what the Germans had done is they had packed a lot of this stuff in fur coats. So they put all this stuff in fur coats to protect it, for the bubble wrap and stuff like that. What some industrious members of the 99th figured out is that the fur coats were not on any list at any point in time. So in the 1940s and 50s, there were a handful of Norwegian-American wives that were walking around with fur coats that came from Merker's Mine. It became a gift that they brought home to mom or the girlfriend or something else like that. On a much more serious note, the medical crew was informed that they had to meet at one point, and they were brought in. What we can't figure out, and I've got a graduate student who's helping do some work with this with Eric Bruin, what we can't necessarily figure out here is if they were one of the first groups in to either Erdruf or into Buchenwald, but they were at the liberation of Buchenwald. Some of them were going to be guards later on here as well. There's Eisenhower again. They were there with Eisenhower. Margaret Burke White, the famous photographer, will be there with them. The men complained about her later on because she kept trying to stage. She wanted to make sure that she had pictures that showed American GIs with the dead bodies to prove that in the future, all of this. The other 2 pictures are actually from members of the 99th. The crematorium that they have here and the infirmary here are both men that were taken by men from the 99th here as well. World War ends, May 1945, and the 474th, along with the 99th, is going to be sent to Norway, finally, after all this time here. What today sounds like a picnic, they had to be a little bit worried because there was Operation Werewolf, which was this idea that even if Hitler were to die, that the Germans were supposed to fight on. They didn't in Norway. They surrendered very quickly here. The picture you're looking at, and this is something, again, that every soldier was very, very proud of. They were part of the honor guard when the king returned in June 5th, 1945. Unfortunately, my picture there cut off. You can't see the king returning their salute as the 99th goes walking by. One of the really cool things, though, too, is one, a lot of the 99th, like 40%, were Norwegian. This is their first time getting home. This is the first time seeing family since 1940, maybe even 1939, depending on how long they've been part of the Merchant Marine. So that was really touching. I also love there's a lot of photos of somebody with a grandpa and grandma, or a second cousin, or a great aunt, or something like that. These are people they had heard about, but they had never met before. And so I really like a lot of those photos that they have there as well. And then the last comment about the men in Norway here as well. I always got to be careful because there's sometimes descendants of 99ers in the crowd that I'm talking to. And if there is, I'm not talking about your grandfather. I'm talking about all the other men in the 474th. But the increased number of photographs of Norwegian women really seem to take off. If you look at photo albums, there seem to be dozens and dozens and dozens of photos of young women. A lot of times they seem to be at beaches in bathing suits as well. It seemed to be in the next major interest that a lot of these young men had at this point in time. They stay in Norway throughout the summer and into the fall. A lot of the men wanted to stay. They actually really enjoyed it in Norway. Speaking of those young women, we do know for a fact, the best guess that we have, I should say, 78 war brides came home from Norway, came back to the United States from Norway. The two pictures here are Liberation Day. I think it was the 4th of July. If you'll notice, we got a British, American, and Russian flag. So the king was honoring the nations that liberated them. And then in the end, they ended up going home. And in my personal opinion, then they disappeared. They kind of just went their own way. They had an association. They used to have reunions and stuff like that. But I've got a couple of theories with this too. One, they're part of that greatest generation, the 1930s and 1940s. That generation did not do very well at bragging about itself. They didn't come out and talk about their exploits all the time here. Two, I think this group would be interested in having a conversation about this, but I do believe being Norwegian or Norwegian-American, more stoic Norwegian-American, sharing or bragging about these stories and stuff like that. I've talked to a lot of the children and grandchildren, and a lot of them kind of say, no, they never really said anything about their time during the war. They'd have a funny story or two or something else like that. And then they just kind of fell between the cracks, as I was saying before. No one really sat down and said, we need to write a book about these individuals. We need to do research on them. There's stuff out there, but part-time they're with the 3rd Army, and sometimes they're with the 30th Infantry Division, and it kind of goes back and forth like that. And that was a lot of information very quickly, so I hope I was able to share as much as I can with everybody else here. And again, feel free to contact me if there are questions I can't get to with all this, but I really appreciate all your time. Let me talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. So now it's time for any and all of you to submit your questions via the chat, and I will communicate those. While you're doing that, I think I'll start us off with one of my own questions. Since I'm the moderator, I'll take the privilege. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what life is like in the unit. So you mentioned, right, that sometimes they would slip into speaking Norwegian with one another. I mean, so these are this is one of the quote unquote kind of ethnic units, right? I mean, is it an ethnic unit? Like, do you see evidence of that in other ways, right? The language they're speaking, the food they're eating, or the culture, the kind of cultural practices that they're doing, or is this an American unit, or how can we think about it?
Yeah, it's definitely a combination of the two. It's an odd mixture. The language is there, and today we talk about Spanglish. I get the feeling that it was a Norselish type of thing, where they would kind of created their own language along the way. When they were training in Camp Hale, the song that they usually sang as they were marching was Lutefisk and Lefse. So we got Lutefisk and Lefse NAHA can't have a meeting without Lutefisk and Leska being mentioned at some point in time along the way here. But yeah, I think it was mostly a group of Americans who had Norwegian heritage who were working with a bunch of Norwegian nationalists and learning about their culture that way. I think they were filling in gaps along the way of, well, we didn't realize how Americanized we had become over these years.
Yeah, I would imagine it was an interesting kind of mix, right? That you said around 40% are actually from Norway, and then maybe you have a third, fourth generation Norwegian-American. And so you have these kind of misunderstandings or really cultural encounters, right? Within that group as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That kind of makes me wonder about one of the questions here where, especially as we get the replacements, but maybe also before that, are these men given any kind of training or education on Norway in terms of like culture, history?
Yep, at Camp Hale, they had a school that if you weren't completely fluent in Norwegian, that's where you had to go and had to learn. That's why I think a lot of the discussions between the Norwegians themselves and the Norwegian-Americans came in as to, so what exactly are you trying to say here? I think I know what you're trying to say, but you need to be a little more clear with this. And so not so much cultural type things, but mostly just a language school.
Okay, so a lot of emphasis on them being able to speak the language, but maybe not necessarily know other things.
Right.
Okay. And with that, thinking about, again, the relationship between the Norwegian nationals and the Norwegian-Americans, was there any tension there that you picked up on in the things that you've looked at, or?
No, I never read anybody making any kind of comments derogatory about each other or having any problems. The replacements were brought in. Only one replacement that I read, and this is something that when he was an older gentleman, he sat down and just kind of wrote out for his family. He had some complaints about some of the commanders that he was working with, and he didn't feel like being his last name was, and it was an English sounding name. He felt that he may have been singled out a little bit by the others because he didn't have a Norwegian sounding last name. But literally he was the only one I ever heard that had any kind of complaint or talk about any animosity between each other.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the Viking imagery that the 99th Battalion used? I mean, we saw right on the patch that they have the Viking kind of ship. Do we see kind of other usages, and how were they discussing the use of that?
Yeah, the Viking ship was the very first patch for the 99th, and it'll be there for the 474th as well. They'll also be given the nickname the Viking Battalion. So they will hold on to that's nothing that's been official. There's nothing that shows up that says, but that was kind of what they gave it themselves. So yeah, outside that, no, there was nothing else. There was any kind of conversations about keeping the traditions or the heritage alive that way.
Sure. How were the members of the 99th distributed around Norway after June? Or can we talk a little bit about kind of that latter part of their stay there?
Yeah, they land, majority of them land in Oslo. Some of the 474th, and this is where it gets tricky because the 474th will take some soldiers here, but they'll be up in Bergen, Smestad, Drammen, and Oslo, I think, are the four major areas that they're going to be in. The original thing was, let's be careful, let's check on Operation Werewolf, because they had to get 350,000 Germans transferred back into Germany here. And everybody, all the stories I read, the Germans didn't cause any problems for the most part. They were helping set up the government again. They were kind of a police force. They were arresting some of the Nazi high officials and things like that. Otherwise, they referred to it as I can't remember how they put this. It was kind of a party for a few months. The Norwegians were happy to have them. They were happy to be there. They spent a lot of time just getting to know the locals, spending time with family and friends.
Great. There's a question about the unit's casualties. I mean, they were involved in some of these major battles, as you mentioned. Do you have a sense of that off the top of your head, or?
Numbers wise, no, I can't give you like this certain percentage of this many died. I have to check into that a little bit more. But yeah, unfortunately, there are a number of the 99th who were buried. When this Darcy Manthai, who I mentioned before, I took a group of students on a tour, a World War II tour of Western Europe. And at the Normandy cemetery, the American cemetery in Normandy, and Henri Chapelle in Belgium, there are 99ers who are buried there as well. So yeah, some of the soldiers are still left over there.
I wonder if you can talk about whether you know if the 99th had relationship to like Camp Little Norway in Toronto, or the Camp Norway in Nova Scotia.
The only connection I know of is that sometimes Norwegian officials, military officials especially, would be at one and come to the other, like they'd come to Camp Hale, or they'd be up at Little Norway. Otherwise, I don't know like any troops that transferred or worked with one another outside of kind of just the official status.
Okay, yeah. There's some people who are wondering if there are other memorials or exhibits about the 99th in the US. You had the picture of the one at Camp Ripley.
Yep, Camp Ripley has an exhibit. Those of you who are in Minnesota, Camp Ripley just got some funding. They're going to be building a brand new museum. And so we, the 99th board, is really working hard to carve out a really nice space for them to show more of the history that they have. The Vesterheim has a fantastic display down there as well. Otherwise, there's a few places here and there. Camp Hale, by the way, as I don't know if I mentioned before or not, Camp Hale is completely gone. That entire picture I showed you, there's not a single thing left there. You can see the outline of a few of the buildings, but there's a memorial with the 99th's name on it, and I believe some of the soldiers that may have passed away, if I'm not mistaken. But otherwise, that's pretty much it. There's not much out there.
Okay. One kind of final question here that I'll ask, and then I know that Amy has some announcements and things that she'd also like to discuss, but I wonder if you could talk about, if you know, the kind of other ethnic units, if they had histories, and was there any relationship between these ethnic units?
100th Japanese will go on to fight in Italy and gain a lot of attention over there. The 101st Austrian, they will train for a while in Indiana, but they just completely disbanded. They never got the numbers that they were looking for. The Greeks will do the same thing. They will kind of be sent off to a special forces unit later on. And they were there when FDR came to visit. So the Greeks are actually part of that, off to the side a little bit there as well. But no, the rest of them just kind of disappear by the wayside. The Norwegians, the Japanese, and the Filipinos are the three that kind of lasted the longest.
And they don't really have any relationship to one another, or?
No, until today, when we've reached out, we kind of work with, because we were all kind of born of the same mother with the same idea at that point in time. So they've got that kind of connection going with it.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much. And for any of you who didn't have your question answered or have additional questions, again, Dr. Ward's email, one of them is 99, right? 99thkw@gmail.com. So 99thkw@gmail.com. And then I'll thank you very much for your presentation. I learned a lot. It was really interesting to hear you talk about it. And now I'll turn it back to Amy, who has some concluding announcements for us and a survey.
Great, thank you so much. Scott, was there anything you wanted to?
No, I'd just like to thank Kyle for his presentation. It was very informative. And thank you, Anna, for your work as moderator.
All right, I will second that. We really appreciate your, both of you this afternoon, your being with us and sharing this information with us. If you're not a member of NAHA and would like to consider that, we welcome you. And again, you can do that from our website. We invite you to become a member. If you are a member, we just want to encourage you to stay in touch, and we will do the same. So keep an eye on our website, our Facebook page, our quarterly newsletter, which comes to your mailbox, and then new as of February is a monthly e-newsletter. So if you're a member and for some reason the e-newsletter isn't reaching your inbox, check your spam filter. If it's not there, let me know. We might need to update your email address. So please look for that. It comes out around the middle of the month. And that is it. I just want to say thanks to all. Thank you again, Kyle, and take good care, everyone. And I hope we can meet face to face one of these days soon.